Where do you stand on Tom Brady being a lifelong New Englander?
I have no thoughts on Tom Brady. No, that was very shady. No, I'm a Giants fan. So my dad is a Giants fan. So like
So you kind of hate the
used to
Patriots.
shit talking. So being a Giants fan just warrants it. So
Yeah. How's it feel being one of the few people that has beaten Brady?
it's an honor, honestly. It's an inflated ego, and then we're just reminded that we keep losing. But you know what? We still won that. So.
What's going on, everybody? My name is Yonas. Welcome to Without a Roadmap. It's the podcast for product folks who don't have all the answers. I'm joined here today by my co-host Cameron and a very special guest. I want to introduce today Ashlee Jeannot. She's the founder of letsSTARTtogether LLC and the author of Knowing How to Talk About Race in the Classroom, a guidebook for white educators to develop racial literacy and the tools needed to engage in conversations and discussions centered around race. Ashlee received her master's from Tufts University, shout out to the Jumbos, in diversity and inclusion leadership, and is currently working at Salsify as their equity, diversity, and inclusion program manager. Ashlee, so great to have you on the show.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
We're also very, very excited to have you on. When I saw your title and read a little bit about your background, I was just hyped to talk and learn more from all the stuff that folks like you do in organizations and across the board and everywhere else as well. So to start things off, I think it makes sense to kind of talk a little bit about your background and what inspired you to enter this field that you're in.
Yeah, that's a very deep question sometimes for me. So I primarily grew up in Mattapan, Massachusetts, and so Mattapan's like heavily Black, Caribbean, specifically Haitian. And so my grandfather bought the house in like the 70s, and at the time Mattapan was like white Jewish. And so at the time when I grew up in Mattapan, Black, no grocery stores, liquor stores in every other corner, no school. There's only elementary, there's no like high school in the town, but like 2 minutes away there's Milton, right? And we all know like what Milton, like, you know, the richness and the quality and the resources that Milton, Mass has. And so particularly for me, why I'm inspired and why I'm in this work is really just taking from my experiences of living in a redlined community, a community that did not have access to resources and adequate healthcare and education. That really fueled my desire into this, that led me into this work, if you will, of trying to address racial inequities and racial justice. So yeah, I think I literally just took from my childhood and was trying to make a career out of it, if you will.
Yeah, no, that's great. And that totally makes a lot of sense. I'm glad you've been able to find a path to kind of take what inspired you as in your youth and turn it into a profession and a livelihood. That's always great to see.
Yeah.
So I feel like before we get too deep into the conversation, it might actually be helpful for us to like take a step back and look a little more holistically at equity, diversity, and inclusion. Kind of, I think it's an organization in a lot of companies now. It's becoming a little bit more prevalent, especially with recent recent racial and kind of unrest coming more to the public eye. So I'd love to hear in your terms kind of what the organization means to you and kind of also with the, background of working at Salsify, kind of what that looks like in, a tech industry.
Yeah, for me, I think, typically it's typically stated as like DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion. And for me, my framework is always EDI, or at least starting with the E, right? I think there's no point in diversifying a community, a space, and trying to build inclusion until we talk about the systemic barriers that exist, right? And so in tech, it goes deeper than like, hey, where do we post our jobs, to get, diverse talent? It's how do we acknowledge that, STEM access is not equal, right? And how do we acknowledge that like Black folks are particularly more likely to drop out of engineering programs within the first year, and women, and so on and so forth. So that's my one spiel about the just DEI in general. And I think for tech companies have historically been white men, white cis straight men. And I think in the recent years, 5 years, I think communities have pushed back on them. But as a result, right, like for like Apple or Google, you're like 14,000 employees deep. Like, how do you even start to have this conversation about, racial justice when your core founders are like cis white men from your elitist schools, and they're like, hey, like my internal pool is white, so like, hey, I invite these other white men, and so on and so forth, right? Like, it's at a point where it's like everyone like is now looking back like, oh damn, this is really white. So I think it's a lot of work of, one, again, back to the point, acknowledging the barriers, acknowledging like, how many organizations in tech has failed BIPOC folks and other marginalized communities. And then also it's like that personal development too, right? Like when you're at Stanford University in your engineering program, you're probably not talking about race. And so maybe the recent events like of George Floyd got you thinking about race and racial unrest. So it's a journey for many folks where professionally and personally, where you're like, I have a lot of work to do in terms of my awareness.
That was a very well thought out and great answer. I think part of the topic with the whole tech industry, like the value of moving fast in tech, how that's always like the speed of tech and how that's always hit on by founders, by VCs, of how you need to move quick, especially if you want to scale and like grab that market opportunity. And part of that scaling obviously is you never really, or well, for the most part, founders and other organizations aren't really thinking about scaling the diversity. They're more so thinking about scaling the team and doing it quickly so that they can then reach out or start building more products and start selling more stuff to hit these goals set internally and by VCs. And so really wanted to hear your thoughts and opinions on like how to kind of balance that with the scaling portion. Because I was reading actually, like I think a week or two ago, like one of the main jobs as founders is to always be recruiting. And so that when you're actually ready and have the funds, resources to actually go and make those hires, you can do it from obviously the best people you have in mind, but also from a diverse pool of people as well.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Also, I think it's so important to know, I tend to have a very radical approach when it comes to things. So
I love it. Let's do it.
There's that. I think, to your point in terms of pace, I think oftentimes like tech companies have no issue like meeting their revenue goals, have no issue like meeting their investor board goals, have no issue meeting the goals of like their executive team. But when it comes to DEI, there's always that, well, like we tried, well, it didn't work out, there's not enough talent. And it's like, well, did you put the same amount of energy into it as you did these other avenues? And I think it goes back to tech, especially looks at DEI as an afterthought and not as their like strategic plan, right? It's like, if you want to make a place that's inclusive, that's equitable, like you have to talk about race, you have to look at gender, you have to look at disability and so on and so forth. And you're not thinking about that when you're a startup. Like you're thinking about like, do I have bread for the next day? And like, and it's valid to some degree. I can understand that excuse. I can entertain it. I don't agree with it, right? I feel like oftentimes the excuse I hear from organizations is that you need folks that hit the ground running, right? Like you need, you can trust your internal, like your referral pool, or you can trust hiring from someone from your competitors because like they'll be able to just again hit the ground running, right? Instead of like ensuring that your training and onboarding can like really nurture and develop people. And so that's what goes back to like equity, right? Like if you want to hire diverse talent and whatever that's a whole bucket in itself what that means, but like you have to be willing to also address like your training and onboarding, right? Like you have to just like get rid of this idea that like everyone can hit the ground running, because that's not a luxury that's afforded to people of color, period, right? Like if I'm not set up for success at an organization, I take that personally, right? Like I'm like, would this have been the same experience if I was white, if I was a man? And so, and we're oftentimes like looked at differently. Like if we make a mistake, like I mean, and I can't speak for all people of color, we're not a monolithic group, but like, I think oftentimes you're just looking at yourself, well, if I make a mistake, how would this be viewed because of my color, my skin, and so on and so forth. So I think it's in addition to my point earlier about, making the investment from a strategic level, I think it's also like at the same time, can people really hit the ground running? Can we really ensure that in order to get diverse talent, right, we're investing in our training and onboarding so that like we can build them to what we need them to be?
Yeah, I think it's super interesting because it becomes a compounding problem when you don't think about this from the beginning. I know, like as a company, Parlor struggled with this. We were very kind of looking at the group, the first 6 hires. There was one woman working on the team, and we recognized the more men that we hire, the more difficult it's going to become for us to hire more women. And on top of that, with fewer women, within the organization, how are we going to make sure that they feel comfortable even working here in the first place and building kind of, the structure with which we can support them ongoing. So it's so important to start it from the beginning. And I'm curious what the role of ED&I is in kind of, trying to build that structural change so that, companies don't run into those problems.
Yeah. I think for me, it's definitely just an educational component, right? It starts with education. And I had this conversation with someone the other day. We were talking about like, LGBTQ plus identity. And I was honest with them. I was like, I didn't understand the concept of gender and sex until college. Like no one broke it down to me in a way that like is what it is now in terms of like thinking about it. And I think for a lot of folks, when it comes to conversations about race and other identities, I think people are uncomfortable because they don't know. They have no idea. I mean, heck, people like, how many times have you like been assumed to be Jamaican or like anything other than what you are? And you're like, hey, like Black, there's other, identities within Black, right? And so, yeah, I think in terms for me, when it comes to equity, I think it's the educational component. It's having those uncomfortable conversations. It's having that conversation about like, this is race, this is ethnicity, this is whiteness, this is white supremacy, and this is how it exists within our organizational structure, regardless if you don't want to see it or not, because it exists. So I think equity is really just, but even beyond that, like even when we post our jobs, even the schools that we attend or solicit from or get interns from, right? Like if you're only focusing on one school in Boston that's majority white, how is that equitable? How do we have like biases show up in terms of like elitism, in terms of do we want that candidate from Stanford or are we willing to invest in someone from a historically Black college or community college and so on and so forth? So yeah, I'm really all about just in terms of equity, I'm really just about challenging people. Yeah, I just want to shake the room.
Yeah. You brought up a good point of like some of these conversations being uncomfortable to a lot of folks, partly because they're not really as aware as when the conversation is going on. So they don't feel comfortable speaking up or voicing their opinions because they don't want to offend other people, which is totally reasonable. I think we saw a lot of this in the summer over the George Floyd murder and all of the post actions that responded from it, particularly around the Black Lives Matter movement. So I really wanted to see like and hear like your thoughts on how other companies kind of handled that and what were like some of your opinions on that. You don't have to name any individual people, just like a broad, just like overall theme. Because I know from folks I know personally, and then also here at Parlor, we had some of those discussions and people did that I know say that they were uncomfortable talking about that because they just didn't really know what to say. And so I just wanted to hear your opinions on that.
All right, so let me just name drop. No, just kidding.
Call them out.
Like this now. I think for me, outside of like, I'm a Black woman, right? And so period, like I very much operate like that's always on my mind, my Blackness, and how that impacts me on a daily. So when you see organizations, when I saw organizations posting the little Black squares, the little commercials, I was like, well, where was this energy? 2 years ago, I'm like, and I don't mean to sound so like evil about it, but George Floyd was not the first Black man to be murdered at the hands of police officers. the Black Lives Matter movement dates back to Trayvon Martin. Where was the same energy applied then? And so for me, on one end, it taking out like who I am as a DEI practitioner, I think I very much was insulted by the performative allyship that many organizations shown, especially when you're posting a Black square and you only have one Black person in your entire organization. I was like, wait, this doesn't correlate. So yeah, but then now putting on my DEI practitioner lens, I get it, right? Like when you are not exposed to these conversations, and it also take into account that COVID allowed people to pause even more. I think that definitely helped build momentum. But I mean, even we saw in studies, right, white people's support in terms of for Black Lives Matter movement has dwindled post-June, right? And so if we have the energy in the beginning and then people fall off, and for whatever reason, are people truly as committed to these efforts? I think organizations have a lot to do in terms of being proactive rather than reactive. I would have much rather preferred than a Black square. I would rather you just put out your DEI data, like how many Black folks do you have at your organization, Latinx, Asian, and so on and so forth. What are you doing in terms of diversifying your job boards, the colleges you attend? I mean, also like even like something drastic, like are you going to commit to like your next investor being a Black woman or so on? Like, where's the investment beyond just this little cute little Black square and that quote from MLK? I definitely did not see that. And I won't name drop, but I'm sure we know plenty of organizations that did that. So yeah, it definitely is disheartening.
In our episode that just went out, we actually spoke a little bit about this topic, about how we, the last guest, Mark Hurdle, and myself, and I believe Yonas agreed too, that we would rather see like the action that you plan on doing when you make these statements, rather than just putting out a blanket statement to kind of just fall in line with the rest of your competitors, the industry, so you can kind of save face. So that was one of the things we talked about in our last episode.
One of the frustrating parts of it is that they're like, I feel like these companies actually do receive some sort of social capital from, these performative actions, so it is actually kind of supportive of their bottom line by doing this, but it really doesn't do anything to further these movements or these causes. Because I feel like it is very easy nowadays to put those messages forth without actually any concrete action. So I think that to me is the frustrating part of it, is that people feel like they're doing something, and that that they're good for it, and I think it really stifles like true progression and actual action. And I don't know, it's just a thought there.
One thing I was super excited about for the episode today was learning more about like the overall goals of the DE&I, or the ED&I, however you prefer to say it, organization within a company. Like what are like the milestones or goals you all kind of track towards, and like how do you implement certain programs to make sure that the company is moving in the right direction to hit those goals, like some of the day-to-day responsibilities coupled along with like the overall like goals that department within the organization kind of strives to do.
Yeah, it definitely varies, but I think for me, if definitely partnership with the employee resource groups or business resource groups, I think is really instrumental in my work. I think they lead conversations as it relates to their own identities and thinking about intersectionality too. So I think they're a great resource in terms of building their own leadership development to lead conversations for the organization on an array of topics. In addition to that, like I think it's also creating like an inclusive environment, like collecting data on, retention and who's staying, who's leaving, who are we hiring, and from where. It's also, the educational component, training, talent. Yeah, I talked about talent acquisition, or even like external partnerships with colleges, and different job boards. So yeah, it's a lot to say the least. But it's literally involved in every aspect of the organization. But I think it's important to note that like the efforts that I'll be doing for like, say like an engineering department will look different from like an HR department, right? Like because of the work that they're doing. So there's no like one-stop approach. It's like there's like the organizational DEI efforts, which is really just about building like an inclusive environment for the community. But then when you get like into different departments of an organization, you can be working with how do you like reviewing like your interview questions, your interview process, like in terms of the HR lens, or like if you're working like in think about tech, like engineering or seeing product development, like what's our language like with clients and internally and so on and so forth, or even diversifying our clients. So yeah, it really, there is no one stop approach. It's a lot, but fun work, very fun work, exciting work, and thoughtful.
Mm-hmm. So when, say a company were to bring someone like you in or somebody in the D&I space, like what are like some of like the first things you would do or kind of think through when you're starting at a new company and trying to bring this approach to that company?
Yeah. So I'm very much a data person. I come with receipts. So I very much believe that in the sense of like DEI, like nothing is sustainable until like I measure how the current organization is doing. So like typically I would recommend like doing like an inclusion survey or something, if you will, right? And so like we're asking questions as it relates to DEI. We're breaking it out based on demographics, you know, like how are said groups responding, like how are Black women responding versus to white women, identifying any trends, and then like you're using that as your benchmarking data. So typically, like I think in the consulting world, or I think a bad practice is that organizations like compare their data, like they find other organizations that compare themselves to, and that doesn't really make sense, especially when you think about if you're public or you're not, and your size, and so on and so forth. And so I think building your own internal benchmarking data to measure against is better. And then ultimately, it's like also like an audit. If like the first things I would do is like the survey, essentially like as an audit, if you will, like reviewing our policies, our programs, like are there languages where it's very explicitly problematic, or are there things that are missing? So yeah, that's always my first goal within Q1, Q2 of an organization, is to really focus collecting on data and research. And then Q3 or Q4, if you will, just be like reporting out that data and identifying the strategic plan.
That's really interesting because I feel like it's worth talking about the differences between your organization, your kind of your consulting company, letsSTARTtogether, and kind of the almost creative agency that you have to work within a consulting capacity with a company versus being an employee at an organization. And what are some of the pros and cons of both of those from your experience?
Yeah, I feel like in education, like, I mean, like a few weeks ago, I was like leading a conversation on decolonization. So like, I feel like there's more advancements, if you will, in terms of like where people are in terms of like their DEI maturity, whatever that means, of like, hey, we're moving beyond just like DEI and talking about like, we know that racism exists. We're like, now people are like, how can we decolonize our syllabi and curriculum? And so on one end, like I'm being more progressive in some work, if you will. And then on the other end, with some corporate clients, you're at the baby level where we're just like, you can say Black. So like, where
that's a great point. I feel like there's a lot of like hesitation when calling people Black people or saying people of color or saying African Americans. Like,
yeah,
that it annoys me to no other level. And because I have also a tendency to just like eye rolls, but yeah, I do want to meet people where they're at, but I'm just like, it's 2021, like just be Black, like please.
Mm-hmm. Capital B if you're writing it out, please.
Yeah, capital B. But yeah, I think at corporate, it's oftentimes because like in these spaces they weren't talking about DEI, like the whole taboo was like, what happens at work stays at work, like leave personal like life out. And then you're like, you have millennials and Gen Z that are entering the workforce, like, hello, like we need to have this conversation. So I think corporations are being reactive, whereas in some educational institute and spaces that I'm in, they're being proactive.
Mm-hmm. I think that's another good point you just made of how older corporations have to kind of adjust with the times, because like you said before, you can just go to work, everything stays at work, and then you can go home. But now with technology, the world is always in your pocket, everyone is always on the internet to do their job at work. When we were still like in the office, now it's probably even multiply because we're at home on our own Wi-Fi. We're not blocked from certain sites, so we can just do whatever we want on our own Wi-Fi. And so like the world is constantly at our fingertips, and we're always getting alerts, notifications. Like during the whole Black Lives Matter movement in the summer, like that's thrown in your face the entire week when you're trying to work, because you have your friends talking about it, you have tweets going off, Instagram posts, like all these things and all these protests, and it's all in your face while you're also trying to do the work. So I think it's a good point to bring up how like corporations can't really try to ignore that anymore, because it's prevalent in everybody. It's like distracting in the sense that people have jobs that need to be done, but it's hard to do those jobs when the world is happening also.
And I think especially in tech, like I think there's this idea that you're just supposed to keep working. I mean, like you have to meet your bottom line. And it's like, how am I supposed to meet my bottom line when the world is in cahoots, right? Like, you know what I mean? Like, I definitely had no qualms calling out Black. And that's something I'm very much comfortable with. I had no qualms reaching out to a manager in my past last year. I'm like, hey, I will not be working today. I'm not comfortable to be in a space, and I definitely don't want to lead a conversation about this right now. And I think more organizations need to be open to that, especially when we think about mental health. And what it means to just be a person of color especially in the past 4 years. Like it was a very trying time. Okay. So I think, I think organizations definitely have to tweak and meet people where they're at.
Mm-hmm. Do you have any like suggestions on how to go about approaching your manager with those kind of conversations? Not only for Black people, but there's other people that also go through things that we're not always aware of. Either way, if you're a foreign person in America and you're dealing with things back home that no one is really paying attention to because it's not on our news. So just maybe any tips and suggestions on how to approach those uncomfortable situations with your manager to say, hey, I need some time because my world is a little crazy right now.
It's hard because I recognize that my personality is not like everybody else's.
Yeah.
But no, I think, and it really depends on your relationship with your manager. I think if you're someone that has a good rapport with your manager and you're able to have these conversations, and you kind of get a sense of that when you're interviewing, I hope that if this is a space where they're inclusive. But yeah, I think just reaching out, hey, this is what's happening, and this is how it's impacting me, and I just need time. I think if you're someone that doesn't have that rapport with your manager, I think it's a lot harder. Hopefully you can utilize HR in that space. But I think in tech, we're privileged with typically with, like unlimited PTO, if you will, or like, just, mental health day, or not mental health days, but just PTO days. So I think there's a way to be strategic about it. But I also think it's a learning opportunity too for your manager. Just like, hey, like, I don't know, like to your point, like international issues, like if you're Nigerian and you were impacted by it's still impacted by what's going on with the NSARS, like maybe it's like, hey, this is what's happening. I know no one else on the team understands it, but here's why it's important for us to at least allocate space for a conversation, or here's why I'm leaving. I think it also adds educational component too, if you want it to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's important to remember that this is not just for Black people. I think mental health is, I imagine it's a big part of what you do in general. And that's, white people have mental health issues too. And I feel like the inclusion component, dealing with people who have, different learning abilities, and, I'm sure even ageism falls under that. So I feel like this is, this conversation has been a lot, just because we're a group of Black folks, it's kind of been, top of mind, the topics, but I feel like the need for, ED&I and organization spans just, much further than the need for the Black individuals within the organization. It's like, there's much more.
Mm-hmm.
No, I think you bring up a good point. I think there's a difference between being minoritized in tech and being underrepresented. I think for East Asian or South Asian, like you're typically represented more in spaces of tech, but there's still that barrier of like we're not represented in leadership, and so the needs or for equity for you looks different for a Black or Latinx or another person of color. So yeah, I think that's a good call out, that EDI efforts look differently for different groups based on their needs.
Right. And I think to end this podcast, I think one of the things really wanted to get to was, where do you view the need for the DE&I to actually be represented in the organization as you're starting to scale and as you're starting to grow? So you go from small to obviously to large. Hopefully that's the goal of every company. Where do you view starting out that as a priority, like the DE&I program within a company? And like, how do you make that business case of why you should start early? I know earlier in the conversation, we talked about how it's important to start early, but kind of wanted to hear your thoughts on like how you make that case for your organization to start doing that. So for example, I would say a lot of our listeners aren't really in the executive leadership role. So they don't have like the final say on saying, hey, we should start being more aware of our employee population and making sure it's diverse and inclusive. So how would you recommend like building that case to maybe either to bring to your manager or to kind of just raise the awareness within the company when you're early in?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. I think bringing it up with your CEO, depending on how the access to the CEO, I'm hoping, especially with COVID, more CEOs are allowing space for like discussion and Q&A. And I think that's one way to do so. I definitely believe that roles such as mine should be on the executive level, because I believe it is an executive, like issue, right? In terms of like business strategy overall. So for folks that don't have currently DEI measures at their organization, highly recommend, I don't like this word, but like escalating it up, right? Like having that conversation with executives about the importance. And ultimately, like for some people, diversity, we understand like diversity is a business case, right? Some people see like the bottom line, the revenue goals for it. And so sometimes you have to like alter your pitch that way. And for other folks, it's like, hey, like this is like just what I'm passionate about. So I think it's also important to meet folks where they are in terms of how they view DEI, to stress the importance of it.
Well, I hope folks listening can, take some of these lessons and apply them in their workplace. I know we could all use a whole lot more of it. Ashlee, thank you so much for your time and this conversation. One of my favorites so far on the podcast. And, hope we can have you back again sometime down the line, and wish you all the best in everything that you do.
Appreciate you. Thank you so much.
Yes, we appreciate you having on. I'm glad I learned so much about this whole space because I definitely wasn't as aware of everything that goes on. So thank you for schooling me and giving me the free game here.
Yeah, can we plug Let's Start Together? How do they get reach out to you for the folks who the book.
Plug the book.
Plug the book.
For the people that aren't watching on YouTube, she is holding up her book. We'll plug the book in our tweets and in our LinkedIn, so everyone can grab a copy.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Of course. All right, without further ado, we'll see you all next week. Be sure to smash that like button and subscribe.
Oh no.